ahead of time. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat over here. I can see them. And then there will be time at the end as well for any questions. And I'm very, very excited to have so many people interested in our Loudoun Amphibian Monitoring program. This is going to be the second season of doing this program. And the first season we had a lot of great interest and we had a lot of great participants. And we got a lot of information and knowledge about our frog populations in a lot of areas in Loudoun County and outside the borders of Loudoun County. I know we do have a few people here from different parts of Virginia, and that's the beauty of this program, is that it is a national database. So it doesn't have to be in Loudoun County. We are just, I think, probably one of the most active so far chapters for the FrogWatch, National FrogWatch organization. So if I can, there we go. So the amphibian training is going to be broken down into several parts. We're going to talk about kind of why it's important to monitor our frogs and toads, different habitats that are included in this, identification, because that seems to be one of those that's kind of tricky, the protocols, locating appropriate habitats, and questions and answers as well. And I'll also talk at the end about some of the other things that we have kind of up and coming for anyone that wants to participate in this, as well as other things that we have coming up. So our frog and toad populations, and this particular training is specifically dedicated to monitoring frog and toad populations. It is a very important thing, especially in a county such as ours, where growth is happening so quickly. Our wetlands are disappearing very, very quickly. People don't often realize that approximately 30% of our amphibians worldwide are threatened with extinction, and over 40% of the population worldwide are showing declines in their population. We do consider amphibians, frogs and toads included, to be indicator species. And that means that the health of a specific area can be gauged by the health of your local amphibian populations. Your skin is very permeable, so water, air, any contaminants in any of those, soil, can be absorbed through the skin of our amphibians. And if it's an unhealthy environment, we will see declines in populations in our amphibians. And the reason for these declines can be habitat loss, pollution, and disease. And I put down here with the chytrid fungus. It's not a huge problem in Virginia yet, but it is a problem pretty much worldwide. And chytrid fungus is one of the largest reasons for the recent decline in our amphibian species. And it's waterborne. It is a fungus, and it's likely spread through direct contact with those fungal spores from an infected animal. They are actually doing a lot of research on the chytrid fungus, and I was reading, I think it's a lowland leopard frog in Arizona. Some researchers with the Smithsonian last year have seen that they actually have the ability to fight the chytrid fungus. So they're investigating why this particular frog species can actually fight that fungus. But it is devastating to populations where it's present. So when we look at our frog and toad habitats, we're going to define those different habitats. And a lot of people don't realize how many different habitats frogs will actually live in. So we have a swamp or woodland swamps. A swamp is an area where the land is permanently saturated or filled with water. Swamps are typically dominated by trees. There's transitional areas that are neither total land or total water. Freshwater swamps, they tend to form around lakes and streams. So if you're ever in an area where you've got low-lying lakes, low-lying streams, in a forested area, and the land around that is completely saturated, where if you step on it, it squishes, you're in that kind of a woodland swamp area. And those levels will fluctuate just like any other place due to those seasonal conditions and flooding. And you have a lot of water tolerant vegetation in those conditions. Freshwater marsh, one of my favorites. They're non-tidal and they're non-forested. They often will have a lot of grasses and sedges. So as opposed to your swamps, your marshes are not going to have that dominant trees as the vegetation. It's going to be more of the grasses and sedges. But again, it is considered a wetland, and a wetland has a certain percentage of saturation of the soil. And you're going to find these freshwater marshes at the mouths of rivers, lakes, and areas with low drainage. So again, they're going to have hypersaturation, and sometimes you're going to see that water actually over the level of the soil. Bogs or fens. We actually do have quite a few of these bogs and fens around Loudoun County area. They tend to be mossy. They are a wetland, and again, it is that squishy type of soil when you step on it. Water comes into the bogs in a similar manner that it does a vernal pool, where it comes from melted rain and snow. The only thing about a bog is that it's comprised of a peat moss, so it absorbs a lot of that water, whereas a vernal pool will hold that water. And the bogs are very, very low in oxygen, so they tend to be somewhat acidic and rather cold. And they also have a lot of mosses in them. So, and you'll see, because of the fact that it's low in oxygen, that the decomposition of the dead plants is actually a very slow process. And we do have those around. Phillips Farm actually has some boggy areas there as well. And they're kind of a neat, interesting wetland. One of my favorites, the vernal pools. Vernal pools are very, very unique habitats, and a lot of times people don't even realize what they are until people point them out, because for the most part, about 3/4 of the year, they do not have water in them, depending on the environment, depending on how hot or how dry it's been. They are small, shallow bodies of water, and they don't have a permanent inlet or outlet. So they are basically depressions in a forested ground area, where they are filled it depends again on the temperatures and the precipitation. They're filled oftentimes in the mid to early spring, sometimes in the midwinter. Like I would expect a lot of our vernal pools will be filling up in the next couple of weeks, starting to fill. And then they will actually dry up as the temperatures rise and the precipitation decreases. So each winter and spring, they will fill up by the rain and snow, and as that melts, it will fill these vernal pools. Vernal pools are an extraordinarily important area for a lot of amphibians for their breeding grounds. They do not contain fish, and as such, it makes it a safer place for them to lay their eggs. Wet meadows. Wet meadows look like meadows. They look like fields with a lot of grasses, tall field grasses, meadow grasses, flowers, etc. But the ground is completely saturated. So during any kind of wet season and even into the drier season, you're gonna see that high level of saturation in the soil. And our ponds. Ponds are defined as an open body of water that are less than 20 acres. They do not dry up in the summer. They must always contain fish, and they have little emergent vegetation. So you're not going to see a lot of vegetation coming out in the middles of them. You will see them around the edges of these ponds. Yeah. So I'm just making sure everyone can still hear me okay with my internet. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, making sure. Thank you. So our identification of our local frogs and toads. We have a very healthy variety of frogs and toads in our area. Some of them are very, very small. Some of them, like our bullfrog, is actually the largest frog in the United States. So we're going to look at the difference between our frogs and toads, and then look at the difference between the individuals. So physical characteristics of the difference between frogs and toads. Frogs, they tend to have stubby front legs. They have slender bodies, and their hind legs tend to be a lot longer because they usually are swimmers and jumpers. A lot of times their hind feet are webbed, and sometimes their front feet are webbed as well. Typically, not always, but typically they have smoother and moister skin, and they will lay eggs in bunches or clusters. If you look at frog eggs, they look like little marbles, oftentimes of jelly with a dark circle in the middle when they're laid, and they're all laid together in these clusters. As opposed to toads, toads oftentimes will lay eggs, most of the time the ones around here will lay eggs in these strands, and some of them are twisted strands, they almost look like DNA, and some of them are twin strands that are two strands that are laid in conjunction with each other, and they also have that jelly marble look. They can be a little bit smaller, and they have the black center in them. So it's actually cool if you find any kind of egg masses for frogs and toads, you can watch them develop within the egg. If you go even daily or every couple of days, you can see that development occurring in real time. Toads tend to have, again, stubby front legs, both of them do. They tend to have chunkier bodies, and they will have shorter hind legs, better for walking and some smaller hops. So toads are not the ones that are going to be hopping large distances. They're mostly going to be doing little small hops or walking. Their skin is drier and bumpier. We call it wartier. And so we only actually have 2 true species of toad in this particular area. I know that some people who are maybe down a little bit further south, you might have some ones that vary from what you're seeing here. And I can send you guys a link to know some of the other ones you might have in that area. So our local frog species are spring peepers, cricket frogs, upland chorus frogs, and those are all really, really tiny little frogs. Green frogs and bullfrogs, pickerel frogs, wood frogs, gray tree frogs, cope gray tree frogs, and leopard frogs. Those are the frogs that we have in this area. The toads are American toads, Fowler's toads, and eastern spadefoot, and it's actually not a true toad, but they put it under the classification of toads. The data for the local species that you're seeing is compiled through the Virginia Herpetological accounts. So it's very important to know that if you're hearing a species that you don't see on this list, if you're in Loudoun County and you don't hear, you're hearing it, you don't see it on this list, let me know, because we can get recordings of that call and we can potentially verify an additional species that we haven't heard before. And that's not outside the realm of possibility. The monitoring of amphibians and reptiles in this area has been relatively weak. So we still have a lot to learn and a lot to see and find out from these guys. So this is our little spring peeper. And before, I hope everyone can still hear me, before we get started, our spring peeper is one of the first ones that we're going to hear in the spring. They are extremely loud, very easily identifiable, and people are amazed at how small they actually are. They are approximately 1 inch to 1.5 inch in length. They are identified, you can tell they have this X marking that goes across the back. And that's one of the strongest identifiers for the spring peepers, because we do have a couple of others that are rather small. They breed a lot of times in the vernal pools, and they will go to freshwater ponds if vernal pools are not present. They do lay hundreds of eggs, and they attach it to aquatic vegetation. And most of the guys that you're going to see here do attach their egg masses to vegetation so that it can be anchored to something and stay safer. The eggs actually hatch within 1 to 2 weeks. So it doesn't take very long from the time that they are calling and breeding to the time the eggs are laid and hatched. These guys are actually, I enjoy them a lot. If you're actually down at a pond where there's a lot of them, it can actually be quite deafening. So we're going to listen to the spring peeper call. My volume is on up. And tell me if you can hear it. Hang on 1 second. Can anyone hear that? Okay. We had this problem last time though, when we had the second speaker. What happened? Give me 1 second. That sure sound?
Yeah.
Spring peeper, Pseudacris crucifer.
No. Can you hear that? I can't hear it either.
I can hear it.
Yes, we hear it
You
now.
can? Okay. Funny enough, I cannot. Mhm.
Spring peeper, Pseudacris crucifer.
You can hear that though? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we hear it.
Okay, I don't need to hear it because I know what it sounds like. As long as you guys can hear it, that's perfect. So that should be a very recognizable sound to a lot of people if you've been outside in the woods at all. Driving by in the early spring, late winter, and you're driving by any kind of water, whirlpools, forested areas, you'll hear this in mass. And that is your little spring peeper. And they get very, very loud, and can be there in large numbers. And with the spring peepers, there's different breeding styles depending upon what animal you're talking about. But the spring peepers, there are these little guys that are about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and they get to breed with the female, and it depends on the quality. And so whoever has the best call and is the loudest males. So these little teeny guys make a huge amount of noise. And we have several that do that. Eastern cricket frog. Eastern cricket frog looks very, very similar to your spring peeper, which is here. They're approximately the same size, which is, again, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in length. So they're very, very small. The Eastern cricket frog will generally have these green markings, and oftentimes it can make this Y shape you see here on the back. These guys, believe it or not, are actually considered to be tree frogs. So your spring peepers, once they're done breeding, they actually go back into the woods. So you're not going to see them in the water when they're not breeding. And spring peepers live at about the first 3 feet of the trees. They live on the ground and the first 3 feet up of a tree, but they are considered a wood or a tree frog. So are the cricket frogs, but they are smaller, a little bit smaller. They tend to have these little warts on them. So you can see it's not always a toe that is warty. So they have these little warty bumps on them, but they actually are a technical tree frog that doesn't climb a tree. So once they are done breeding in the water, they will go, and actually most of the time is spent around the trees and on the ground in the leaf litter and vegetation. But the thing with them that's different than like your wood frogs and your peepers is, even though they don't live in the water, they will live in the vicinity of water. So they actually want to have that soil damper than some of the other frogs. They lay fewer eggs than the other frogs, and they lay them one at a time, and they attach them to their aquatic plants. So as opposed to a large mass, they're going to lay them one at a time and attach each one of those eggs to the plants. And again, they hatch within a week, and they are able to jump over 3 feet. So these little 1-inch frogs can jump quite a distance for their size. So we're going to try this here, and let me know if you can hear this. So this is your Eastern cricket frog.
Northern cricket frog, Acris crepitans.
Yes.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Trying to. Is that coming out?
Yes.
I'm not sure why I'm not hearing it. But you can tell why they call it a cricket frog, because it sounds very, very similar to a cricket. Our next small little guy is an upland chorus frog. These guys have quite a variation in pattern and color. They can be greenish, they can be reddish brown. They do have dark stripes that run along the side of their body right here on both sides. And they have a white line ridge right here on their upper lip. And again, they are about 1 inch in length. They also are considered a wood frog or a tree frog, but they tend to be almost completely terrestrial. They don't tend to go up in the trees, and they do live more, kind of like the cricket frogs, they live near more permanent bodies of water where that soil tends to be damper. They lay smaller clusters than some of our others. They lay about 60 eggs, and they, again, attach it to the aquatic vegetation. So let me get this up and let me know, make sure you can hear it.
Upland chorus frog, Pseudacris ferriarum.
You hear it? Perfect. These guys visually are probably the ones that are most commonly mistaken for peepers, because you can see they look very similar, but to me they look like a shrinky-dink wood frog, which we'll see here in a moment. Green frog. This is one of my favorites. These guys are one of our larger frogs, and they are actually very commonly confused with our bullfrog. So we'll talk about kind of the differences between these two guys. These guys are usually about 2 to 4 inches in length. They have what's called sexual dimorphism, which means that the males and the females are different in appearance. In both these guys and the bullfrogs, the tympanum, which is this ear covering right here, is twice the diameter of the eye in a male. So if you look at this one and you look at that diameter of that tympanum, and it's the same as the eye, this is actually a female green frog. And the same goes for our bullfrogs as well. So they can be anywhere from brown to green in color. Their body can be completely green. The body can be light brown, dark brown. They all tend to have a lot of green on the face, which is why they get their name green frog. They live typically near any type of freshwater pond. These guys to me are one of the most opportunistic frogs. If you put a backyard pond in your backyard, you're going to get green frogs. If you put a half barrel with water and plants in it, you're going to get green frogs. Apart from gray tree frogs, these guys are also ones that are going to show up in a lot of areas because they're very, very opportunistic, and they can live in a variety of areas as long as they have access to water. Their eggs are laid in more permanent bodies of water. A single clutch of eggs can consist of about 1,000 to 7,000, and they tend to attach them to aquatic vegetation. So this is our green frog. This one people will often identify as like snapping a rubber band or a banjo string. So again, let me know if you can hear it, making sure.
Green frog, Lithobates clamitans, formerly Rana clamitans.
Everyone hear it? Okay, perfect. In this one, I think you can hear 2 other frogs in the background. I think that there's a gray tree frog and a peeper in the background of these, but we're listening to the one that's the banjo string. And these guys actually, and we'll see on a chart, these guys actually call a little bit later than some of the other frogs. So this is your bullfrog, and this is the largest frog in North America. It is, it's a little bit of a beast. They grow upwards of 8 inches in length. And these guys are primarily aquatic. You're going to find them in lakes, ponds, marshes, any place where there is constant standing water. And they typically are green or a grayish brown. They tend to be more active at night, and they will eat, much like any other frog and toad, they will eat anything that fits in their mouth. But the fact that they are so large can be quite impressive, because that can include some rodents, birds, etc. because of their size, they can eat larger things. Frogs and toads by nature tend to be very gregarious. It's just a little more impressive when you see a bullfrog eating than some of the others. The females are slightly larger than the males in this case. And again, the tympanum will tell you as well. This one here is twice the size of the eye. So this is actually a male bullfrog. Where confusion can lie in with a lot of the identification is that you can have a younger bullfrog and an adult green frog. But the difference, big difference is the green frog has what's called dorsolateral ridges, which are these ridges, and they're on both sides. They run from the eye all the way down to the hip on the side back right here. And if you look at the bullfrog, those are absent. So that's one of the quickest ways, because you can have a green frog that has the same coloration, but that's the quickest way to be able to determine. The other real way to tell is that a bullfrog's face is more rounded, whereas a green frog has a more triangular mouth. The rostrum of the green frog is more triangular. These guys can lay up to 20,000 eggs in masses. And these guys, they don't tend to attach to vegetation. They will float, actually free float on the surface of the water. So here is our bullfrog. And again, let me know, make sure you can hear it.
American bullfrog, Lithobates catesbianus, formerly Rana catesbiana.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the nod. I appreciate it. Again, these guys are nocturnal in nature, so a lot of their calls is going to occur at night. Most of your frogs' activity is going to be at night. These guys are almost specifically calling in the evening to nighttime. This is one of my favorites. This is a pickerel frog. To me, they kind of look very serious and slightly grumpy. Pickerel frogs are, again, a slightly larger frog. They're about 1.5 to 3 inches in length. So they're kind of in the middle size right there. They are found in wet, moist woodland areas and around water, but they are not an aquatic frog. And they tend to be tan or greenish in color, and they are often confused with a leopard frog. But if you look, and I've got the leopard frog, I think, coming up next. Yeah, if you look at the patches on this guy here, there's these, it's either 2 or 3, and that just depends on the specific individual, of these square patches that go down the back in a line. So they'll either have 1, this one has 2. Some of them do have a 3rd in the middle, but they will be in a line and they'll be more of a square shaped going down the middle. Whereas if you look at this leopard frog, it's more haphazardly placed. So there's no real structure or rhyme or reason as to how these spottings occur. And they're more globular. They're not as square as on the leopard frog. And again, as with the green frog and the bullfrog, the pickerel frog does not have the dorsolateral ridges, and you can see the dorsolateral ridge right here on the leopard frog. So these guys will lay a few thousand eggs, and they attach them to the aquatic vegetation. These guys are actually quite fun to find. They're very, very striking in appearance, but they are also very secretive. So these guys, if they're not breeding and not out feeding, they will typically, they're ones that you can find underneath logs, underneath rocks, any place where they're out from the open. So here's our pickerel frog. And we'll do the thumbs
Pickerel
up if you can hear it.
Lithobates palustris, formerly Rana palustris.
Yeah. And these guys you're going to find more in the woodland area. So if you're in an open field or open meadow, it's highly unlikely that you will find them because they do prefer that shaded covered area that those wetland areas will provide, those wooded areas will provide. And here is the often confused one with the leopard frog. We have, you can see this is a subspecies. We have a couple of subspecies of leopard frog in Virginia. And these guys are approximately the same length as the pickerel frog. And again, they can be brown to green in color. They can have these, and they have these splotches, but they can be different sizes. Sometimes they're a little bit absent. Sometimes they're more depending on the animal. And again, they also have this white line right here on the upper lip as well. And that's another identifier for them. They tend to live in areas where there's slow moving water, ample vegetation. They can inhabit open meadows really far away from the water sources. These guys, contrary to what we all think about a lot of our amphibians, they don't need to have a constant source of water. What makes them amphibian is that one phase of their life is spent in a damp water setting, and that can take on many different forms. Amphibians being very, very different. We have lungless amphibians. Yes, lungless amphibians, and actually a lot of times their eggs are laid in mud. So the water that they're getting is actually the water that comes from the mud. So they don't have an aquatic phase at all. But the amphibian part just means that part of their life is in some form of an aquatic phase or an area surrounding water. In some cases that might be surrounded with mud. They do lay masses of eggs, up to about 5,000 eggs, and it's going to be in the kind of still, warm, shallow waters. And here is our leopard frog.
Southern leopard frog. Lithobates sphenocephalus, formerly Rana sphenocephala.
Can you hear that one? Okay. I get the smiley face. It makes me happy. I know that we're hearing it. Wood frogs. Wood frogs are one of the, if not the first one to emerge in this area up in Northern Virginia, and a lot of different areas in this mid-Atlantic region in the late spring or late winter, early spring. A lot of times you will see them. We actually found them actively starting to breed in the vernal pools at our Black Oak at the end of February last year. And I'm sure that they were there beforehand as well, but because they had already had some established populations going to the water. These guys are, as the name suggests, a wood frog, which means that they spend most of their time in the forested areas. The only time they come to the water is for breeding. So these guys are very, very loud. They have a very unique call, which we'll hear in a minute. And they actually have quite a range of colors. They can be brownish, they can be gray, they can be a kind of a reddish color. The thing that makes them very distinguishable is that they have this on both sides, this mask that goes from the tip of the snout and kind of goes across and behind the eye down to the back of the jaw. And it is on both sides, and it is very distinctive regardless of what color the overall body is for these animals. Again, they do live in woodland areas, so they will live up in the trees, and they tend to live pretty good high up in the trees after the breeding is over. And they lay their eggs in vernal pools. These guys, when they lay their eggs, their masses are very, very large. They almost look like the size of softballs. And it's not, each egg mass has a good couple of hundred eggs that's in each one of those masses. And the size of that overall mass will be about the size of a softball, made up of a bunch of what look like little marbles stuck together with black on the inside. And that will be the developing frog over a period of time. And again, it doesn't take very long from the time that they're laid you're talking about just a matter of a couple of weeks before they are hatching out and before they're actually into these vernal pools. They do develop relatively quickly as the vernal pools will dry up. So these ones that actually breed in the vernal pools earlier have a greater chance for some success because of the fact that the vernal pools are not drying up. These guys are pretty amazing in what they can do. A lot of our amphibians are able to tolerate temperatures that we don't think that they would be possibly able to tolerate, seeing as how we kind of lump them together with reptiles. But our amphibians can tolerate a higher variance of temperature, including cold. So you'll see a lot of our amphibians coming out in the cold temperatures for breeding. These guys are the only species of frog that lives north of the Arctic Circle, and they actually have a special biological antifreeze that prevents their ice from forming and their cells from freezing, and they have the ability to stop breathing and their heart can stop beating in extremely cold temperatures. So these guys are pretty amazing in the adaptations they have to different temperatures in different areas, which makes them successful in a wider range. And they're actually very loud. Now these guys, their breeding is a little bit different. You will actually see them in the vernal pools, and there might be 10 or 12 of these wood frogs on top of one female, and they will push each other off and shove each other off, and whoever is able to get into what's called amoplexus, which is the breeding position, is the one who gets to breed with that female. So as opposed to the female being able to make the decision based on the quality and sound of the call, it's these guys actually will push each other off, and whoever is best to the last man standing is the one that gets to breed with the female. So here is our wood frog call. We had a lot of wood frog activity last year. Had a lot of reports of people hearing a lot of wood frogs, which is very nice. Where's that going?
Wood frog, Lithobates sylvaticus, formerly Rana sylvatica.
We hear that one? And these guys are very loud, much like the spring peepers, and they actually will overlap the breeding time. So a lot of times these vernal pools, you will see spring peepers and wood frogs at a very similar time. You will often hear wood frogs calling day and night. You can also hear spring peepers calling during the day, which people always assume that they're at night. But the quality and the amount and intensity of their calls increases exponentially at night for the peepers. The wood frogs, they don't care. They will call day and night. So it's very easy to find a vernal pool where you're going to have these wood frogs just during the day by listening to these calls. We have two types of gray tree frogs in our area, one of which is more common, one is less common. The more common one is our gray tree frog, which is this guy right here. And it's, even though the picture is not looking the same, it's the almost identical, because they can, and I'll talk about it in a second, they can change their texture and color. We also have a Cope's gray tree frog. So the gray tree frog can be a variety of different colors and a variety of different textures, oftentimes depending upon the background, depending on the temperature, depending on the amount of light. They are approximately 2 inches in length, and they are a true tree frog. They only come to the water for breeding, and unlike the wood frogs that stay in the water until the breeding is complete, and the spring peepers as well, and some of our others, these guys actually travel nightly to the water. So during the day, they're back in the trees, and as night starts to fall, they will start to migrate towards these vernal pools for breeding and for breeding calling. They do have the ability to, and you can see with this Cope's tree frog, they can actually texture and get a little bit bumpier on their skin. They can also change a little bit of the coloration as well, again, depending upon the environment around them. They are pretty much identical to a Cope's gray tree frog in size, in times that they call, times that they breed, etc. The only difference is those calls. So you'll be able to hear the distinguishing of those calls. They stay in woods that are near temporary and permanent water sources, but they actually are a tree frog, so they spend their time in the trees. Their eggs are laid in about 1 to 2,000, and they will lay them in shallow bodies of water. They can be in tire ruts. They can be in anything. I helped somebody last year get them out of their above ground pool because they were breeding in her and calling in her above ground pool. So any water, any source of water that you have around, gray tree frogs are the other one that's very, very opportunistic. And the thing about a gray tree frog is if you look at their toes, they have the ability to climb any surface. So they actually have the suction cup toes as opposed to some of our other frogs. Like these guys have it as well. They are a tree frog, not as much as well, but some of these other guys have more pointed toes that are better suited for more terrestrial life. But these guys truly have toes that are suction cups, and they're able to attach to any surface. So it doesn't matter if you've got an above ground pool, if you have a pond that you put in, these guys, if it's a water source, they will find it. And they are very, very loud, and they will call into the wee morning hours sometimes if the weather is just perfect. These guys, much like a lot of our frogs and toads, love the weather that we don't. So that's one of the things with our amphibians, is they tend to appreciate the weather that we don't. So here is your gray tree frog.
Gray tree frog, Hyla versicolor.
Here. And for anyone in this area, this might be a familiar sound. And again, that's a frog that's about 2 inches in length, and it can sound incredibly loud. So your Cope's gray tree frog is very, very similar again to your gray tree frog. The Copes tend to be more east. So if you're in the eastern Loudoun County, you're more likely to hear the Cope's gray tree frog. You're actually probably going to hear a mixture of both. Western, you're going to hear mostly the gray tree frog. And if you start to head into Fairfax County, mostly what they're going to have are the Cope's gray tree frogs. Again, they tend to lay eggs again in groups of a couple of thousand, but their eggs are grouped usually in about 10 to 40 eggs, and they're attached again to aquatic vegetation. They live in the same areas as a gray tree frog, and they have the same calling breeding season as a gray tree frog. So here's the difference, and you'll be able to hear it on the call.
Cope's gray tree frog, Hyla chrysosceles.
So you can hear that difference of those frog calls. And those are two frogs that look identical. And the only way to really tell the difference is the difference in those calls. And that's our frogs in this area. Now, our toads in this area, again, we have two true toads and one that is usually classified in with a toad, but is not a true toad. So the first one is our American toad. These guys are fairly common. They're a good sized toad. They're about 2 to 4 inches, oftentimes around 3 being, of course, the median. They generally tend to be a brownish color. They can be most any. They can be red, they can be brown, they can be olive, they can be gray. They tend to have these little warts that tend to be a yellowish or reddish color. And if you see behind here, they tend to have 2 large warts immediately behind the eyes. Okay. They do live in a variety of areas, from forest to meadow to fields to suburban neighborhoods in your garden. So they are actually a very prolific toad in our area. These guys lay eggs that are long spiral tubes. So I was talking about what kind of looks like DNA strands. And they're two long rows, and they tend to kind of weave them around vegetation. So as opposed to them being globular like the frogs, these guys are longer strands in two long rows, and they tend to be a spiral. These do, all of our toads do secrete a bufotoxin. It can be mildly irritating to our mucous membranes. It can cause smaller animals to become ill, but they have to really be kind of chewing on some of these toads to have that ill effect. We do have one snake, which is one of my favorite snakes in the area, that is specialized. It's called the Eastern Hognose, and it's specialized that its main prey is our toads. So the bufotoxins actually don't cause them any ill. Instead, they're doing research to see if they actually utilize that bufotoxin to their advantage to not become predated on by something else. Oh, and here is our American toad. And I always try and time to see how long these calls last. They have a very long call.
American toad, Anaxyrus americanus, formerly Bufo americanus.
Can you hear it? It just amazes me how long the call goes on. And here is their similar in appearance. We have a Fowler's toad. Fowler's toad is a same length, about 3 to 4 inches or 2 to 4 inches, around 3.5 is the average. Again, they can be brown, gray, olive green, reddish. Their warty spots tend to be a little bit darker instead of that yellowish color. And a lot of times you'll see some warding within some of these markings they have as well. They do have a pale stripe. They can go down the back, and that will indicate that it's an adult. The belly is uniformly a whitish color, except they tend to have one dark spot on their belly. But as opposed to the American toad, which you can see this underside is not white, the underside of a Fowler's toad is a whitish color. The males may be darker than the females. And again, they live in very, very similar areas to American toad, open woodlands, meadows, just a variety. They're very, very opportunistic. And you can see here too, and we talked about the shorter legs. These guys have a lot shorter legs than a lot of your frogs do. Your frogs are going to have those longer legs for jumping. So just froze my screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. So they have these shorter, stumpier legs than our frogs do, and chunkier bodies. You can tell that they're a lot wider and chunkier than our frogs are as well. These guys will burrow in the ground for winter hibernation. A lot of our frogs in the area will burrow in the ground or will utilize the leaf litter that is around for hibernation. So it's another good reason to not clear up the leaf litter that's around, because a lot of our animals will use that for hibernation, not just our amphibians, but a lot of our insects, some of our bats, et cetera, will use that leaf litter and the warmth that it creates for hibernation as well. And again, they lay in strands of up to 20,000 eggs, and oftentimes it's after a heavy rain for these guys. They will lay them in shallow areas that don't have a strong current. And again, they excrete the skin secretions as well that are distasteful to many predators. And this is our Fowler's toad. Again, a very, very different call from the American toad. I sometimes feel sorry because the American toad's a little more elegant.
Fowler's toad, Anaxyrus fowleri,
Can you hear that?
formerly Bufo fowleri.
Yeah. So it's not as long and elegant as the American toad. Yeah. Okay. And this last guy here is our eastern spadefoot. This guy here, I still will give the prize to whoever finds the eastern spadefoot. They are one of our most unique of our toad frog families of amphibians. They are about 1.5 to 2.5 inches in length. They are, as you can see, quite a different looking animal. They actually are a brownish color. They have these yellow stripes that go down their back. Okay. What they do have as well is they have a spur, a hook on the back of each hind leg for burrowing. Eastern spadefoot spend most of their time underground. They will hibernate, and the only time they come up is to breed and eat. These guys will dig these spirally burrows, and they prefer kind of a sandy, silty soil, so nothing with too many tree roots or anything that's going to be hard to get through. They actually will lay their eggs in these very, very fragile strands in some warmer water. They come up for just a short period of time, about a month, maybe 2 months if you're lucky. And this skin secretions cause an allergic reaction sometimes when the eastern spadefoot is handled. This guy right here is actually considered a species of higher concern in Virginia. So any sightings, including a confirmed call, which is usually confirmed by recording the call, should be reported to the Virginia Herp Society. So if anybody finds or hears a spadefoot, then I can show you how to do that. We have not yet found one in the past year for our counts last year, but hopefully some year we will. People who live more coastal, where there is a lot more sandier soil, we have a lot of clay out here, but where it's a lot of sandier soil are going to be able to see and hear these guys a lot more readily, and their populations are going to be higher in these areas. So this is our eastern spadefoot.
Eastern spadefoot, Scaphiopus holbrookii.
Can you hear yet? Kind of a creaky sound. And the only real time you're going to find these guys is during the breeding, because you're not going to likely find them at any other time, because most of the time they'll be underground. And that goes for a lot of not a lot, but some of our salamanders as well. Is the only time you're actually going to visually see them is during that breeding time. So this is our chart that has our different species and when they typically will be calling and breeding. Spring peepers are a little bit different because they actually can sometimes have a later call, a secondary call in September to October, depending upon the weather and the availability of water. So they can have a shorter secondary one if the conditions are correct. But these guys come out really early. This is even potentially a little bit late. It could be even as close as the second week in February, depending upon the conditions. And they will call usually through June. You can hear them during the day. During the height of the breeding season, you can hear them during the day, but during the night, the sounds can actually be quite deafening. Cricket frog starts a little bit later, but goes a little bit later. Your leopard frog is another one that starts pretty early. You can see we have a few here that start pretty early. Your leopard frog and your pickerel frog both start pretty early. as does your upland chorus. Your upland chorus has quite an extensively long breeding call time. So as long as there is water available, and again, upland chorus frogs tend to use some of the more shallow, more permanent water sources, which means that that water will be around for a longer period of time. Whereas if you see like the main breeders for vernal pools, it cuts off towards the start of the summertime when we have less water and more heat coming in, and those vernal pools start to dry up. Wood frogs you're going to hear very, very soon, but you can see here this eastern spadefoot toad has a very, very short season. So it tends to be anywhere from like the end of March through the beginning to mid of May, sometimes down to the beginning of June. So, and pardon me, but for some reason it did it a second time. Even though I got rid of it a second time, it still wants to give us all again. Oh. Stand by, there we go. I think I'm losing the internet connection. Let me do this. Apologies. I think we're getting a little cloud cover on here. So what we're going to be talking about next is we're actually going to be talking about the different protocols for the FrogWatch and for the participation in the amphibian monitoring. As soon as I get this rolling, we'll see what we've got. There we go. Perfect. So the amphibian monitoring history, anybody that did, and yes, I will send out copies of charts, and I will actually send out copies of the calls to people so that they have those as a reference. I was looking up at the question. So they have that as a reference as well, so that you can use that as a guide too. So the FrogWatch was actually created originally to study the distribution and abundance of frogs and toads in the US. It was originally started in 1998 by the US Geological Survey. So if anyone participated in any kind of call surveys years ago, US Geological Survey, then it was actually taken over from 2002 to 2008 by the National Wildlife Federation. And now since 2009, it has been under the management of FrogWatch, which is under the American Zoos and Aquariums Association. The wonderful thing about this is even though it has changed hands a couple of times, the data from 1998 is still in their database. So the database has continued through these years. So they're able to see the trends of the populations and abundance of these frogs and toads. So the way this is, and if anyone has done this in the past, or if you have not, it used to be actually quite a process where you would have a route and you would have multiple sites and you have to go and drive these routes. It made it actually very, very cumbersome for participation. Now it actually is, instead of being a route, it is registering by a survey site, which means that if you have a pond in your backyard, if you have created a pond, if you have a lake, or if you have a vernal pool in your woods, if you have even your little backyard ponds that you put in, any of those can be technically considered a location of a site. If you have a marsh or a bog or anything like that, that's considered an area where frogs and toads would call and breed, then we register the site. So registering the site would need to be location of the site, the person who will be monitoring the site, where it's located, and the type of habitat. And this information I will send out to everybody, and then you can fill it out and send it back to me. If you have a site, and I know that there are a couple of people on here that and somebody said that they heard that they were looking to turn FrogWatch over to another entity. And no, we have not received information on that yet. So right now, AZA is still running it. So until it gets handed over, if it gets handed over, then we'll get information from that, and it will just continue on with whoever is handing over the information. There's a lot of data that comes through, and so it can actually be quite time consuming for an organization to take that data. And yes, streams and creeks are considered sites. They tend to be areas where you don't have as much breeding, if mostly at all, for frogs and toads because of the current. But if you have areas where there is not current and there's some more, because a lot of your streams and creeks can have those cold areas where the water is not flowing, those are areas where you can get some of that breeding going on. If you need help finding a site, or you would like me to help you find an area to survey, then let me know, because I can actually help you find a site as well. We have quite a few areas in Loudoun County, Fairfax County. I mean, just a lot of different areas that need to be monitored. Monitoring steps are actually very, very easy. This is actually a very easy process. The site needs to be monitored at least 30 minutes after sunset and should conclude prior to 1 a.m. Meaning, you don't want to go out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's going to change, of course, depending upon when sunset occurs throughout the year. Those are the times, a half an hour after sunset is when your prime calling starts to happen, but oftentimes it will tend to die down towards like 1 o'clock in the morning. So I often find that a half an hour to an hour after sunset is prime time to go and look at these sites. You want to consider the temperature, precipitation, and wind conditions prior to visit, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Upon arriving to the monitoring site, again, some people, their monitoring site is a pond in their HOA. A lot of HOAs have ponds and holding ponds, and those are actually very good breeding areas for amphibians. So we actually do have people who are monitoring those HOA water features that they have. I actually had somebody that was monitoring a fountain that was in an area of their HOA, and there was actually gray tree frog activity at this fountain. You want to note any changes to that site. So if you are monitoring somebody else's site, if you're going to a park or anything like that where we have permission to be, and you'll notice that they're doing construction there, you'll just want to note that there's any changes for that. Record all the weather information, including the air temperature, wind speed, current precipitation, and any weather history. If it was 55 degrees tonight, but 2 nights ago it was 20 degrees, you want to put that and note that as well. And remember to be respectful of the area you're in to minimize any disturbances. This is meant to be a very passive type of observation. So we want to minimize anything that we're doing to that area. The monitoring steps are very simple. If you go to an area, if anyone's ever walked around the woods or walked around where the frogs and toads are calling at night, and I'll get to the wind speed in a moment. When you walk up to them, you'll notice that they all get quiet. And that is just because your presence has been detected. So typically when you go to a site, if you're just still and quiet for 2 minutes, they will start to call again. It is an inherent need for them. It is breeding. It will start again if you're just quiet for 2 minutes. So for 2 minutes. And then when you're ready, cupping your hands around your ears is going to be the easiest way to be able to focus that sound coming into your ears, so you know what direction it's specifically coming from. You're going to listen for 3 minutes. So you want to have a stopwatch because you want it to be exactly 3 minutes. Remain quiet during that 3-minute collection period. Because if you're not quiet, they might stop calling if you make any noise. After the 3 minutes, record the time you started listening, the time you stopped, different species you heard, and the call intensity for each species. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Any additional information gathered, you can document in a notes section. And here's the thing, if you're interrupted by loud noise, So if you're in 2 minutes into listening and a fire truck goes by, then you'll need to stop, give that 2 minutes again for everything to quiet down and start your 3 minutes again. And then just remember to change that start and end time on the data sheet as well. So here's the call intensity index that has been used for quite some time. So if you're listening for frogs, you're listening at a site, and you hear nothing at all, then that would be a 0. If you hear an individual, sometimes you can listen out and you'll hear 1 or 2 frogs calling, then that's going to be a 1. There can be some space between the calls, so they're very, very identifiable. A 2 is you can hear the individuals, they can be distinguished, but you might have some overlapping in those calls. 3 is full chorus. 3 is calls are constant. There's overlapping, there's no gap, no silence really in between those calls. And a vernal pool with wood frogs and spring peepers is a perfect example because it is pretty much deafening and there is no break because of the intensity and the amount of calling and the amount of individuals who are going to be there. You're not counting individuals because that's almost an impossibility, but you're looking at the intensity, and of course a higher intensity of call is going to indicate that there's a greater population. If you're unsure of a call or believe you have a frog or a toad that's not previously been confirmed in the survey area, which are going to be the ones I'll send you guys the information, try to record that call so that we can assist you in seeing if that is a different species that we haven't observed yet, or if that's just a different call from one of the frogs that or toads that we have in the area. So the frequency of the site surveys. This program, this tracking is meant to be start to finish. So if you're going to be doing like your backyard pond, which is absolutely perfectly, I had people who would drink glasses of wine while they were monitoring from their back porch. So from the time frogs start to call, which will be probably in the next 3 to 4 weeks or so, until frogs stop calling, which would be generally at like the end of August, to get that consistency is the ideal. If you can't commit to doing the consistency of that entire season, at least that first spring season is really important to be able to get that, because sometimes at the end of the spring, you'll start to get at least a little bit of the ones that are going to be calling in the summer in that area. You can do one site, you can do multiple sites. I have some people who are doing 3 or 4 different sites, and it depends on your availability. The important thing is that the consistent data is going to be helpful in tracking the long-term health. And it's recommended that the site is surveyed every 2 weeks. Once a week ideal is like the perfect ideal. You don't need to really do more than once a week because of the long overlap of a lot of these calls. They're not going to be calling for a day or 2 and then stop. So once a week, you're going to be able to get some good information as to these different frogs and the intensity and the highest peak of their calls. Once every 2 weeks is kind of the recommended, and that's sufficient. At least once per peak period, and I'll show you the peak periods in a minute, is kind of the bare minimum to be able to at least get an idea as to what you're hearing. So this is kind of what they call the runs or the peak periods, and looking at the different minimum temperatures. These are, again, dependent upon the current temperatures and the current conditions. If we don't have any precipitation in the next month, then the vernal pools aren't going to be filling, and of course our spring peepers aren't going to be calling there yet. So it is a fluid thing depending upon the environmental factors that we have. But typically speaking, as a guideline, your late winter to early spring is considered around February 15th to March 15th. And there's no minimum temperature set. That's because these guys come out when it's 30 degrees, when it's 25 degrees. They don't need a minimum temperature set to trigger their breeding calls and to trigger those behaviors and to trigger them to travel towards a body of water. Basically, theirs is triggered a lot of time by the moisture, by how much rainfall, how much melting of snow, how much of that is what is triggered. It's not a minimum temperature set. The second run is going to be the spring run, which is from that middle of March through the end of April. And those can be triggered a little bit more by temperature. So you're talking about a minimum of about 42 degrees. And that's, again, a nighttime temperature because you're going to be monitoring them at night. So it's not what the temperature during the day is, it's what the temperature at your monitoring time is going to be. Now, if you get out and it's you know, April 1st and it's 40 degrees, it's still okay. You have a little bit of leeway, but if it's 25 degrees, you might want to wait until you've got a higher temperature because some of those animals may not be calling yet. It's not warm enough. Late spring, May 1st to the middle of June, minimum temperature again at night is about 55 degrees. And the fourth run is early summer. And here we have it through July, but there actually are some species in our area, a lot of them that will continue to call through the month of August as well, and minimum temperature of about 65 degrees. So those are the four, they call them runs, run 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the peak time in temperature areas. Wind. So there actually is a way to kind of measure wind without measuring the exact speed of wind, and it's called the Beaufort scale. And the Beaufort scale has been around for a long time, and it's more of a observation rather than actually measuring a wind speed. So we go off by these different categories that have been used for quite a bit of time to look at the conditions based on how much wind we have. So calm wind is a 0, and that's basically if you were to light a candle or have a fire pit, the smoke will actually just rise vertically. There really is no wind or breeze to move it from side to side. 1 is a light air. Your weather vanes are still inactive. You might have a little bit of drifting from smoke. A light breeze is when you have the leaves rustle and you can feel the wind on your face. Gentle breeze is a 3. You have leaves and twigs moving and some constant motion, and your small flags might be extended. Those are basically the only times when you're going to be monitoring. Anything more than a light or a gentle breeze, the wind is going to be too much for monitoring. That can actually muffle a lot of the sounds of the calls and give you false information. So when it gets to be a moderate, where you've got branches moving, it raises dust and loose paper. If you were to have it on a desk and it were to be able to fly off, that's too windy to monitor. Fresh breeze, anything above that gentle breeze is going to be too, when you get the small trees beginning to sway, anything above that gentle breeze is going to be too windy to monitor. And that's perfectly fine. You just come back a different night when the wind is going to be a lot less. I do a lot of stuff over at the Black Oak property, and it has a habit of having some branches falling and such in that property. So I always make sure if I'm going out there, the wind is going to be almost minimal to be able to go out, and it does. I mean, the strong winds don't last forever. So there, you might just have to adjust your day depending on that wind speed. Wind to monitor based on weather. There may be an important relationship between you hear the species you hear calling and the weather conditions. Sometimes the weather conditions are inappropriate for data collection. So typically, and I know we said that, for the early part, the temperature is not a factor, but you are going to get some better calls if your air temperature is above 35 degrees. It's not that they won't be out, but if you want to get the peak for those early guys, I found that above about 35 degrees, above freezing, is going to give you some better calls. Again, frogs, all of our amphibians really like it when it's weather that we don't appreciate. So they like it when it's misty. Those late winter, early spring, slightly warm, but still a little chilly, misty, annoying, sprinkly, misty, rainy kind of nights. That's what they like. And that's what we hate. Where you have to wear a little froggy toggy jacket, otherwise you're going to get a little bit damp. If it is raining too hard, again, much like the wind, the heavy rain will interfere with your ability to hear the frogs calling. The rain will not interfere with the frogs calling because they do actually really appreciate the damper weather, but it will just kind of inhibit your ability to really actually accurately hear them calling through that wind. And again, or the rain. And again, the wind, you don't want it to be stronger than a gentle breeze on that scale, because that will also inhibit your ability to hear. So when you go to a survey site, these are things that I take with me a lot of places anyway. Data collection sheets are the ability to be able to put them onto data collection sheets, and I'll send those out as well. Pens and pencils, nothing is worse than if you go someplace and you don't have something to write with. A flashlight or headlamp. I often use a headlamp, and we actually have ones that are cheap and they're really good because they have not only a white light, but they also have a red light and they have a green light. I oftentimes with the amphibians will use the green light because I can see really well. And I can see the animals, but it's not as blinding of a light as a bright light at night. It tends to be kind of softer color. A watch or a timer. So if you have a timer on your phone, because you're going to want to know when 3 minutes starts for that 3-minute time call. A cell phone. If you're going out to go someplace, it's good to have a cell phone on. I have not heard of anybody having any problems with being bothered by people, but you don't want to have a flat tire or anything like that and not have a way to call somebody. Rain gear. If you're going to actually be getting out to walk to an area, reflective gear, something reflective if you're going to be near a road. And the ability to record sound. I use my phone a lot now. I used to use a little handheld recorder like we used in college to record lectures. But I find that the recorders on my phone work great, and I can actually give that information to somebody more readily than I would if I had to plug in the recorder. And this is a big thing that we will find here. You can ask my husband, it drives him absolutely nuts during especially the late winter, early spring, when everything is traveling to water, is you can encounter the amphibians on the road. Don't be like Jenny, where I sit there and I swerve on our little dirt road to get to our house so that I don't hit them. During breeding season, though, it can be very common to encounter amphibians on the road. It is okay. And someone said, yes, that a mosquito suit will come in handy. Yes, I actually have a mosquito suit. And we'll get into a couple of things, but yes, mosquito suits, as long as you're not going through any thickets with a lot of, I have a netting one because I go into vernal pools, so I don't use the mosquito clothing, because I don't like having the permethrin on my clothing to be able to potentially leach into the water, because of the sensitivity. Permethrin is actually very aquatic toxic. So if I have a mosquito suit, it's going to be actually a netting suit, which I do actually have one of those. And somebody asked, how many times per survey night should we repeat the 3 minutes? Just once per that date? Yes. So each time you're doing that survey, if you're going out once a week and you're surveying a pond, go out once a week, survey that pond, and it's going to be literally a total of 5 minutes if there's no distractions. 2 minutes for letting everything settle and 3 minutes to listen. That's it for that site for that week. That is absolutely it. You do not need to do more until next week or 2 weeks, depending upon when it is that you're going to be monitoring, how often you're going to be monitoring. But literally the beauty of this program is it only takes 5 minutes of your time to be able to do that. So it's not time consuming unless you go and have to drive someplace to be able to do that monitoring. It's literally 5 minutes. So I have a small backyard ponds that we put in last year that got a lot of amphibian. Seriously, as soon as we put them in, we had frog activity in our ponds, like a week later, if that, totem frog activity. So I could literally walk out on my deck and sit there for 2 minutes and wait, and then time for 3 minutes what we were hearing. So it doesn't take a lot of time. And it says if you usually monitor on a Tuesday and it's 12 days before, you can go again on a Thursday, doesn't matter. No, the intervals do not, and it's a good question. The intervals do not have to be exactly the same. You can go on a Monday of one week and you can go on a Thursday of the next week. What I always tell people is if you're monitoring weekly, that's fantastic. As long as you're getting one recording within a 2-week period, that's the ideal. If you're getting one within a 1-week period, that's more of the ideal. But if you've got conditions or something personal has come up, or anything like that, the beauty of a lot of these animals is that their recording times, their breeding times are long enough that if you've got too much wind or too much rain for a week, which we know that does actually happen, that it's not going to ruin the data because you're still able to, again, like I said, the ultimate bare minimum is one monitoring per those peak period of time. So the ideal, or the minimum is once every 6 weeks. So you're able to, if you've got anything that's causing a problem, if you're going on vacation, or if you are sick, or hopefully not sick, but excuse me, or if you have any kind of high wind or too much rain that cause you to have to postpone that, that's perfectly fine. It's not going to affect it because, again, you're talking about animals that have breeding call times over a series of, 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks. So what we're trying to get is kind of patterns of intensity. So it's not going to affect anything. So amphibians on the roads, it does happen. The big thing is that you want to make sure that you are safe. Okay, I don't want to hear of anybody getting hit by a car because they tried to move a salamander out of the road. That's the biggest thing that can happen, especially in our area where people do tend to drive a little crazier than they should. If you can safely do so, you can move the animal off the road. The important part is you need to move it in the direction it was headed. So and a lot of times we sit there and go, well, it's closer to this side than this side, but it's going to turn right back around and head the direction it was going again. Same with if you find a turtle crossing the road, anything like a snake crossing the road, anything like that that's going in a specific direction across a road. That road wasn't there probably 20 years ago, so they're still heading to that body of water. So they are going to head in that same direction. So just move them off the road, but the direction that they were headed. Handling amphibians can be highly discouraged because, except when you're moving them off the road. This is because of the tender, gentle nature of their skin. It's not just the permeable nature, but their skin tends to dry out a lot quicker as well. And our skin being drier, that can actually help dry their skin a little bit faster. As such, I do not tend to wear any kind of bug spray, lotions, anything on my hands if I'm dealing with any kind of amphibians, because I don't want them to absorb any of that into their skin. So you want to make sure you keep your hands wet. You can carry distilled water with you. You can use water from a creek or a pond that's kind of nearby, but you want to make sure, if you can, to keep your hands wet. If you can't, it's okay. You can pick them up with dry hand. Just try to pick them up and move them as quickly as possible, and don't handle them for as long as you can. Because at the end of the day, if their skin gets a little bit dry, but they're moved out of the road, the collateral damage from being moved out of the road is far, far less than, so you're going to have more success if you move them quickly. And if you need to handle them, you just want to kind of gently scoop them up from the bottom and with your hands cupped, and then just cover them up with your top hand and then move them over wherever they need to go to prevent injury, because these guys can be a little bit delicate, and we want to make sure that they're okay. But in encountering amphibians, I have moved my share of amphibians off of the road. And we do have things in this area for spotted salamanders, and they call it like the big night, which is which is just a, and somebody asked if they're injured, are there any special instructions? Yeah, if they appear to actually be injured, then it does get to be a different thing. Because if they are actively injured, like if they have been hit or if they do not appear, a healthy amphibian, unless it's really cold, or they're warming themselves up, like I'm sure people have seen like snakes basking on the road and they're a little bit more lethargic, or the temperature is a little bit different. But if they don't appear to be acting right, in our areas, we do actually see, frogs and toads and salamanders that have been kind of chomped on by dogs or cats. So if they appear to be injured, yes, you can actually put them in a small container. I actually have in my car a lot of times those little cricket holders from like a Petco. Something with that is not cardboard, because cardboard can often be sticky, but that plastic is nice because it's a very smooth surface for them and it has air in it. And then there are several areas in here if it is injured or sick. Blue Ridge Wildlife Center. There's also the Wildlife Vet Center. Blue Ridge Vet often will take, there's a couple of vets who will take, and they're open 24 hours, will take wildlife. But Blue Ridge Wildlife is very, very good about calling, and same with Wildlife Vet are very, very good about calling back. And you can actually call them. I can give people the numbers if they need them. I have not run into the situation where they're injured. Usually if they get hit by a car, they are deceased. But they will do what they can to help them and return them to exactly where they were found, which is a nice thing. We haven't run into that yet, but that is always a possibility as well. Safety precautions. Your safety is incredibly important. So one very important thing is if you feel uncomfortable at your surroundings, just stop monitoring and leave the site. We have kind of a common sense practices for anything is bring a first aid kit. And oftentimes I need to practice what I preach, because I often don't bring a first aid kit and I get torn up by thorns and stuff like that. So first aid kit is nice to be able to just put a Band-Aid over that. I always wear, and you want to wear long sleeves and pants to protect against insects. And like somebody had said, they do make mosquito clothing. My mosquito clothing is like a mobile mosquito netting, which works absolutely wonderfully, except if you're in areas where there's a lot of thorns, because it can get snagged. But other than that, they're cheap and they work actually really well. You want to park in a safe location and be sure that your car does not block any traffic, and test whether your cell phone works from the monitoring site, and take it with you. But you want to make sure that you remember to silence it during the monitoring, because the last thing you want is to be at 2 minutes and 45 seconds and have somebody give you a phone call. So for those 3 minutes, you just want to silence the phone. And another thing that is really helpful to do, and helpful to actually understand kind of the environment that they're in as well, is become familiar with your monitoring site by visiting during the day. So if you have an HOA, or if you've got a neighbor that has a pond or anything like that, go and take a look at it during the day. Be familiar with what it is and where it is and the things around it, because that's going to give you more information for the evening time. Don't monitor if there's severe weather or inappropriate weather is occurring or is predicted. So if that night it says that there's a 60% chance of thunderstorms, you know what, you don't want to get out there and be someplace and have thunderstorms. So just wait till the next night or 2 nights down is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with bringing a partner with you to monitor. It's not something where, you don't want to probably bring 25 people and they're going to be really, really noisy, but there's nothing wrong with bringing somebody with you. Some people don't like to be out and about at night by themselves. It's not a problem. And I always let somebody know where I am, and kind of how long I think it's going to be. My biggest thing is be aware of poison ivy, other types of poisonous vegetation, as well as ticks, hornets, all of those kinds of goodies that are out there, because it does make it for an uncomfortable thing if you're going to get poison ivy in those situations. Locating appropriate habitats for frog monitoring size. Survey size can be any wetland area regardless of size. It can be artificial, so it can be an artificial backyard pond. Again, we put in one that was 8 by 8 by 3 feet with another 2 down that were like 2 by 2 by 3 feet. And they were swarming with amphibian, with frog and toad behaviors and populations last year. It was absolutely ridiculous how long it took. It took days. And as soon as that water was there, it was being occupied by frogs and toads. So it doesn't matter if it is your artificial backyard pond, because you know what? There's a population close by, and your water source is becoming an environment for them. Like, all the safety precautions are additional benefits to monitoring from your own back deck, and wine isn't a bad idea either. So all you back deck monitor people, you are welcome to have the glass of wine after you finish your 3 minutes. You're all set. And somebody asked if it's okay to monitor for more than 3 minutes as you learn the calls. You can, absolutely. But start the process again. So the data calls for a 3-minute time period. So you can monitor every single night if you want to. You can just monitor on a Wednesday night, and each other night you can go out and listen for those calls to be able to familiarize yourself with it as well. But the data that we collect is a specific set of 3 minutes. So instead of it being a half an hour or an hour, you want to have that 3 minutes. The rest of the time, absolutely spend more time there. Spend time that is, you can stay and hang out and listen, because actually it's very relaxing. Some of my favorite times are in the woods by myself in a vernal pool, listening to the sounds around me. I mean, you can't beat it. And you actually learn those calls really, really quickly. So yeah, and somebody said, if you happen to use a more vernal pool type area, that will eventually dry up, so you just stop monitoring at that point. Yes. If your site is gone, then you don't need to monitor it anymore. And that's actually a good bit of information as well. Now, if you have a site that has dried, like a vernal pool, that has dried up, and it's the beginning of June, which is a time when a lot of ours tend to dry in this area, you can always find out if there's any other sites, like if somebody was monitoring a site at a park and they're not able to continue on with that site, are you able to pick it up? But yes, if your site disappears, then that monitoring of that site will stop. And that's kind of the way it works with the vernal pools as well. That's why I put in the little pools here, so I had all the season to be able to monitor. You want to make sure the survey site is easily accessible and safe. You want to make sure, and this is a big one, if it's not on your property, you need to have permission from the landowner. So you don't want to go walking on somebody else's property to monitor their vernal pool, because they don't like it. They don't like it, people on their property. And most of the time, if you know your neighbors, it's perfectly fine. We've even had people who, I mean, Parks and Rec for Loudoun County, they have been so great, because we have a good relationship with a lot of the people with Parks and Rec and everything. Some schools have wetland areas. I know Woodgrove has some wetland areas around it. Tuscarora High School has some wetland areas that they use for the students and everything. So having those relationships with them as well. But the biggest thing is to have permission, because you don't want to be at a school at 10 o'clock at night and have the Leesburg police come and find out want to know why you're there. So it's really important to have the permission from the landowner prior to the site survey. If you don't have a specific location, it can help you find a specific one based on your needs, i.e. like location. If you're out in the Middleburg area, you can find an area down there. I know Piedmont Environmental Council has got property down there that has some wetlands. we can potentially monitor down there as well. So there's a lot of opportunities. If you don't have a place to be able to monitor, I can actually help you monitor. So are there any questions from anybody as far as this process is concerned? It's actually very simple. It's very straightforward. The hardest part for some people is to actually find a site to survey. And again, that doesn't need to be a big concern for you because we can help find that. And another thing is that, and there is not, believe it or not, and that's a good question, there is not a phone app for monitoring. It's really an interestingly sad thing that amphibian and reptile monitoring has often taken a back burner to a lot of other things. We sit there and look at different things. And sorry, I was reading a comment while I was speaking. And we've noticed that some other countries and some other areas actually have apps for calls. So you can actually record, like you can with some birds, you can record the calls and you can put it into the system and it can tell you what it believes it is. We don't have anything like that around here. And so we're looking at that being a potential for developing. But even a lot of programs and projects that are funded for looking at the population health of amphibians are being kind of defunded. So there's not as much being put into looking at the populations of amphibians and everything like that. The thing about the FrogWatch, and somebody was talking about the city data, yeah. And the thing about the FrogWatch is that it is a very specific set of data. It is a very specific set of guidelines. So all the information that you gather will come back to me, and I will send an email out to everybody. Someone asked what the next steps after this call is today, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But all the information will come back to me. And the data sheets are very, very specific. And that information is actually, I put into the FrogWatch data system so that they have it directly for their information and for their database as well. So after today, what I'm going to do is this weekend, probably tomorrow, before the storm. And somebody said they tried contacting FrogWatch groups in Richmond by region and they never got back. And it is, I mean, that's a thing that you will find. And that's a thing why a lot of times when we have like looking at the list, I have quite a few people actually here from different areas in Virginia, because it is very, very time consuming to take in all of the data and have to actually plug in the data. And a lot of people like myself are volunteers. So it makes that kind of process a little bit daunting to some people. So sometimes you have chapters that kind of have fallen to the wayside, and that happens to a lot of things. And this chapter, we're trying to kind of, you never know, maybe we'll become the state area for bringing your amphibian data to. That would be kind of a fantastic thing. So what we'll do tomorrow, before the snow, is I have an email that I'll send out to everybody, kind of recapping everything. I will involve that chart and those frog calls that I had for everybody that you guys listened to on the PowerPoint here. I do have those calls, and I will send those in an email. And it will also have information. It'll have the data sheet, so you can familiarize with what those are. They're very, very simple. And it will have the protocol. So what you want to do, and you do have time, because we should not start to hear those kind of breeding calls for another month or so, is kind of familiarize yourself with different areas, different sites, different potential sites. If you want to do more than one, that's perfectly fine. And then if you send that information back to me there's a site registration form that I'll send out to everybody. You send that back to me, and I will send that in and register your site with FrogWatch. So that every time you send data in, all I have to do is kind of plug in those numbers, and it makes it a lot easier. So once you get that information in, once these calls start coming, when I start hearing them, I'll send out emails to everybody to let them know that I'm starting to hear different frog calls. That's your guide to start going forward. So if you're hearing frog calls, that is kind of your go to start monitoring. There is no specific start date, because we don't need to know the absence of call necessarily, unless you're in the middle of a season. If you have an absence of call at the beginning of the season, especially and at the end of the season, then we know that those dates where you had your first calls and your last calls were when they were active. So we don't need the absence at the start and the end. You don't need to start monitoring on February 15th if nothing is out to monitor yet. So it's very important for us for you to listen. And if you hear those calls, then you can start monitoring. And if I hear those calls, I will let everybody know to kind of be on the lookout that we're starting to get some activity. I was at the Black Oak Vernal Pools the other day, and the melting of last time's snow has caused a good amount of saturation in the dirt, the soil, pardon me for all the soil scientists, the soil for those vernal pools. So hopefully, if we get precipitation out of this storm that's supposed to be here tomorrow, as it melts, it might start to fill up those vernal pools. Once those vernal pools start filling up, that's usually a good indicator that your amphibian breeding is going to start occurring, because a lot of them in the beginning of the season are triggered by moisture content, including your salamanders. We actually have several species of what's called a mole salamander that come out from burrows under the ground. Your spotted salamanders, your Jefferson salamanders. We actually have one that will be having eggs that start to hatch as soon as there's a marbled salamander, and they breed in the fall, and their eggs hatch first thing in the winter. That those things will start to happen as soon as the vernal pools start to fill. And someone asked me my last name. My last name is, well, I have two. I'm married. I have not changed it yet. But Swiggart, Swiggart. You also might see Erickson, Erickson. So, and somebody had asked about the coordinator list of contacts of who, and yes, I actually can get some contacts for people at these different places, because if you have trouble, you don't know who to talk to, because I am a chapter coordinator and amphibian coordinator for Loudoun Wildlife, it makes it so it's a little bit easier for me to get contacts through for somebody other than somebody else. So I can help with that. I don't know the chapter Charlottesville area connect with. And yes, so you do need to kind of be part of the chapter. You can just, I'm reading these as I'm going here. It does need to come through one of the chapters. It doesn't matter which chapter. So if you live down in the Charlottesville area and you don't have an active, and your person's not active, I can find out for you if the person is, if you have an active group and who that person is. And get back to you and let you know. But you can actually, it doesn't matter which chapter you go through, because all of the registration is site specific. So it's not a regional thing. Like Charlottesville doesn't cover for the national database a certain amount of area around Charlottesville. It doesn't matter, because of the fact that it's registered site specific, it doesn't matter which one you report with, if that makes sense. And do I visit a site that is registered by you guys to confirm that it's a good site, or just based on what you're hearing, et cetera? Sorry. They have a stream creek, but also have a large swimming hole and still spots. Basically, I will not come out and visit your sites unless you want me to. If you want me to come out and see if it's a decent site, then that's perfectly fine. The best way to know is we can register it. And if we don't get any activity, then we don't have anything to record from that data. And that's actually sometimes in those cases, it's a good thing to know that that site is not an area where we're seeing that kind of activity as well. And then we'll just have to pick a site. But if you do have a swimming hole and still spots, those are areas where those amphibians can potentially come to call and breed. So Dry Mill Road, yeah, Dry Mill Road has a lot of good areas where they've got some wetlands. So does Mountain Road. A lot of those windy roads along Western Loudoun and everything have a lot of good wetland areas as well. Yeah, my husband's like, just be careful because they're also terrible roads. They're very, very windy roads with not a lot of places to park. And again, the most important thing is to get permission if you're going to be going onto somebody's property. If it's something where you can monitor it from a safe pull off on the road, you're not on somebody's property, but getting somebody's permission, because there might be a potential where you have to walk onto the property, is always the way to go with that. Does it make sense? Does it have any questions? So tomorrow I will be sending people out an email with all of that information to be able to get it going. And it actually, it's quite enjoyable. I think that a lot of people who participated in last year actually had a good time with it. So can I assume if we've heard spring peepers, chorus frogs, and seen crickets, frogs, and Fowler's toads, it's a decent site? Yes, that is a fantastic site. So yes, right now, the way to do the submission of the data is through the chapter. So once you get the data, send it to me, and I will submit the data through through the chapter site. And that way too, I'm a second set of eyes to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed as well. Because the thing that can make it cumbersome on their end is if information is not complete. And it can make it cumbersome because they have to go back and get more complete information. So that kind of takes out that complication there. And potentially, and I always put this at the, kind of at the end, potentially too, there are opportunities if you're finding that you're enjoying the amphibian world and the herp world in general, which involves, you know, of course, our snakes and lizards and turtles and everything like that. There are going to be opportunities for different things. So if you are interested in different opportunities, in addition to, not instead of, because this is extraordinarily important, but in addition to the FrogWatch calls, let me know as well. I can give everybody, I'll just tell you what my email is if everybody wants it, because you'll get it tomorrow as well. But it is J Swigert, so that's the letter J and SWIGGART at loudonwildlife.org. So if you have any interest in something in addition to the FrogWatch as well, let me know. I do a lot of work monitoring, surveying the vernal pools at Black Oak. And we're doing potentially partnering up with some other organizations to be monitoring some of their vernal pools and some of their wetland activities. And some of the things that we're going to need to be able to do to actually further the surveying that's done as well with our amphibians. So there's a lot in the works, and each year that we can get a stronger base, we can do a lot more with our herps as well. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have interest as well in doing some other things, especially this time of year. We're going to potentially be creating and placing cover boards at Black Oak, which are going to be areas for salamanders and frogs and snakes, etc., to be able to have another little habitat, and it's a good way to be able to monitor that, in addition to some other monitoring, surveying things that we're going to be doing as well. So if that's everything, I mean, if you have any more questions, perfect. If you have any questions between now and when I send out the email, just send me an email, and I will be happy to answer them for you. If you have any information specific, I know there were some of the questions about certain parks, Pocahontas, and I think there was a question about the Charlottesville chapter. Shoot me an email, and I can answer those and help you out specifically with that. And I am very excited to get started with this. So thank you, everybody. And thank you for participating. It's actually our poor amphibians and our herps in general, I think, get a little bit of a bad rap sometimes, or get a little less attention than they should. And they're completely awesomely wonderful critters. So thank you guys for participating as well. So I will talk to everybody, and I will send you an email tomorrow. So thank you.
Bye, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your nodding.